Hello and welcome to Dunlop Art Gallery's presentation. My name is Thomas Johnson. I'm the curator of performance and moving image at Dunlop Art Gallery and RPL Film Theatre. I'd like to acknowledge that the Regina Public Library is located on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis. On behalf of Dunlop Art Gallery and in partnership with Neutral Ground Artist Run Center and 91.3 FM CJTR, Regina Community Radio, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion between Judit Bodor, Craig Leonard, and Clive Robertson on the occasion of the birth of art. Art's birthday is observed every year on January 17th and was initially conceived by Robert Filliou. Please note we'll also have other events coming up on this evening, and I'll encourage you to visit the link that I'll share at the end of this introduction. An artist and a thinker who was most interested in researching and developing proposals for a society based on poetical rather than political economy, Robert Filliou spoke of the creative use of leisure time. Instead of political resistance, he used humor as a tool for communication and conflict resolution. Instead of expertise, he defined research as the genius republic and the domain of those who don't know. His ideas of permanent creation, le fait permanent, and the eternal network are conceptual frameworks for anyone who's interested in creating a shared consciousness through participating in creative activities across space and time. The discussion that we'll have here is going to focus on the influence and early example of Robert Filliou's critical and poetic praxis on the development of artist collectives, spaces, and alternative practices. A quote also by Robert Filliou does stress on the back of a publication that perhaps this book will help some people situate me if they want to, but I hope that I'll have enough energy to be already somewhere else once they've situated me. And somebody else in this discussion is also situated Robert Filliou as Greta's great godfather. So after this talk, there will be an opportunity for Q&As, so please provide your questions in the chat bar and we will respond. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Born in Hungary, Judit Bodor works internationally as a curator, educator, and producer over the last 20 years. She's been teaching in UK higher education institutions since 2005 and held curatorial, research, and producer positions in artist-led arts organizations such as Art Pool Art Research Centre, Budapest, East Street Arts in Leeds, and Wave Particle, Glasgow, since 2000. Her curatorial projects include museum and gallery exhibitions of contemporary artists, archives, and new commissions of performance and site-specific artworks. Her practice-led PhD explored curating the archives of historical performance art in the museum through producing the exhibition Silent Explosion, Ivor Davies and Destruction in Art 2015-16 at the National Museum, Cardiff. Craig Leonard is an artist and teacher at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. His recent exhibitions include Central Art Garage, Ottawa, Darling Street, New York, and Double Happiness in Toronto. Some recent publications include his artist project Ironwork for Dirac House, published in the winter 2020 issue of Canadian Art, the script transcript, the Halifax Conference, published in 2019 by New Documents, Los Angeles, and the Stretching Exercises, a book of teaching and learning prompts with Michael Fernandez, self-published in 2018. Clive Robertson is a performance and media artist and artist, curator, critic, publisher, whose work has been seen and heard in domestic and international alternative venues and museums for 5 decades. A pioneer artists collective center media arts instigator in Calgary, Toronto, and Ottawa, Clive was a founding editor and publisher of Centerfold Fuse, 76 to 2014, Arton's Video Publishing, 77 to 80, and the artist's audio and music label Voicespondence, 1974 to 2007. His retrospective exhibition of collaborations, Then and Then Again, Practices Within Artist-Run Culture, was on tour between 2007 and 2013. Retired Associate Professor of Art History and Cultural Studies, Queen's University, Clive is currently producing text, audio, and video works for online research access. Clive co-produced Robert Filliou's videotape, Porta Filliou, and as part of an artist residency series he organized for Arton's Parachute Centre for Cultural Affairs in Calgary. Welcome, everyone, and I look forward to this conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Tom.
Hi.
Hi.
So, Clive, why don't you get us started?
Okay, so I'm going to start with an excerpt from a performance work I did in the mid-'80s called The Ganza Syndrome, which was about the precarity of artists. So this is an artist oath that some artist in Saskatchewan asked me to do for this. So this is the way I'm going to start. It's a collaborative piece. So I want you to wet your finger, put your hand in the air, and repeat after me as you solemnly swear. I will never.
I will never.
Never ever.
Never ever.
Forget that there is nothing.
Forget that there is nothing.
Creatively rewarding.
Creatively rewarding.
About not being paid.
About not being paid.
Thank you. So to begin, I'm going to, we each, these sections, we have 10 minutes. I may not use this amount of time. We have images. I'm going to ask, to show you, for you to see them. You can also visit my Facebook page where I've been loading content as this panel has proceeded that includes audio and video and that you can download, and articles, not just about Philia, but transcripts of some of his work. So to begin with, I want you to think about Greta Thunberg's climate activism documentation, as seen in the recent documentary, I Am Greta, paired with Robert Filliou's project, like his proposal for Cold War peace, that countries should exchange their war memorials, or Filliou's project, La Galerie Légitime, that included a gallery in his hat of his and his friends' miniature artworks that he could show to passers-by on the streets, noting that everyone can have their own gallery. Hi, Waskana. A very long time ago, I lived in Drina, Saskatchewan, population 34, just 30 minutes away from Gerald McMaster, who lived down the road in Red Pheasant First Nation Reserve. For good luck, I am sitting in front of a Gerald McMaster exhibition poster from 1985. My task in 10 minutes is to talk about Robert Filliou's work through the making of the videotape Filliou in Calgary in 1977, and to give you a mere glimpse of a contextualization of Canadian artist exchanges with Filliou and his welcome recognitions and support of artist collectives and artist-run centers as a network in the years 1972 to 1977. Judit will refer to other artists in Quebec, Hungary, and elsewhere who authored collaborations with or about Filliou. Craig will also discuss other practices that are Filliou related subsequently. So 1973 for me is a key moment in this history. Filliou celebrates art's birthday in Aachen, Germany, with a holiday for children and workers. Art's birthday is celebrated following on from Filliou's poem Whispered Art History that in 1963 proposes that 1 million years ago, observing everyday activities contributed to the birth of art. And January the 17th, coincidentally, also happened to be Robert Filliou's birthday. So, Thomas, can we see some images? Is he there? Yeah, okay. So here's a photograph of Robert Filliou in Artens in Calgary in 1977, giving one of his talks And as you can guess, in an artist residency through an artist-run space, we also worked with collaborative organizations in the city. So Robert gave lectures at the University of Calgary, where he performed something called the Gong Show, which was him telling stories that appear in Portfolio and elsewhere in print publications of his activities from 1962 to 1977, 15 years, approximately 15 years. But in that, unlike us, Robert only gives himself 30 seconds to talk about any of the stories. So after 30 seconds, there is a person, Brian Dyson, who hits a gong with a beater stick. And Robert has to stop and move on to another story. The Gong Show, for those pop fans who don't know, was a popular television show in the 1970s. So can we look at the next one? So this is a postcard that was produced after the publication, after the videotape portfolio. The videotape portfolio was 43 minutes long, 45 minutes long, it says here. It's in black and white. And Filliou's discussion of his projects and his thinking is alphabetized here in the tape from A to Z, and you can just about see the titles there. It's, again, this stuff is on my Facebook page, so you can see it better. And it's subsequent to this that I found out, or I've seen other Filliou publications that are organized. What I didn't know at the time was that he started this in 1963 with Petit Robert, which of course is a famous French dictionary. And that's how he first started organizing his projects alphabetically. So could we look at the next slide? These are some of the publications I was looking at, reading back through in preparation for today. And they are in this. I can't point to it. I can point to it on my own screen. So from the top, it's Hannah Higgins's book on Fluxus that talks about Filliou. Hank Bull in Vancouver at the from the Western Front, who was one of Filliou's closest friends and collaborators from the 70s until Robert dies in 1987. It is Hank Bull, I think, I could be corrected, who wrote the wiki page for Robert. Next to that is a book of Dick Higgins's writings. Dick Higgins was the person who reinvented the term intermedia. He was an artist, a Fluxus artist, and a publisher. And he also was a sponsor of Robert's work, including his residency in Vermont in 1973. The next book, Image Bank, is what it says it is. Image Bank, like General Idea and Works, also did collaborations with Robert and his work in the early part of the 1970s, including The Decadence in 1974, which was an early Canada-US exchange that featured Robert Filliou's Art's Birthday. Below that is the Centerfold, 2 copies of Centerfold, in which I published transcripts of Robert's residency. Next to that, in a book you can barely see, is the Games of the Cedelia Takes Off with George Breck. Sorry for the pronunciation. That's a Something Else Press book. Next to that is a book that, for those of us in the 70s, was like a key book for beginning to not even understand, but to give recognition to something called Happenings in Fluxus. Underneath that, the red book is a book that all three of us have and we've read, which is an interesting transcript of a 7-cassette interview with Robert with the Belgian critic sorry, I can't remember her name, Dr. Lebir, let's call her, who actually interviews Robert in 1976, a year before Filliou, and it's in that transcription that I can recognize all of the material that is about to be presented in the videotape, and it then confirms or allows me to recognize the fact that when I was so surprised how well Robert could talk about his own work in complete sentences with humor and everything else, that he had memorized almost the script of the history of his work. The next book is in the black and white book is from the Balkan Art Gallery, edited by Charlotte Saber, Scott Watson, and Hank Bull, and it is a very good Canadian, early Canadian history of interactions with Filliou. The next book, the next catalog is the actual Art's Birthday catalog in Aachen, Germany. The one underneath, Robert Filliou, is a more recent catalog, again alphabetized A to Z of Filliou's work, that utilizes transcripts that I had produced in the mid-70s. The little CD there is a CD re-edition of a cassette called the Gong Show, which is an audio recording that is available of Filliou's work. The book that's on its side, the orange-colored book, is the famous book Teaching and Learning and Performing Arts, which is where many of us first read about Robert Filliou in the 1970s. And the last is something else, Great Bear pamphlet, in which Robert has a text on manifestos. So could we see the next one, please? I'm almost. So this is an example that counters our knowledge of what the early networks were, artist networks that include, and that importantly include, the mail art networks that existed, that were also used by File Magazine, General Ideas File Magazine, and the Image Bank request lists that were authored by Image Bank in Vancouver. There are other prototypes to this. This is another one. This is called the International Artists Cooperation, which was run out of Oldenburg in Germany. And the author, Klaus Groh, nominated foreign contact centers, international foreign contact centers in many different countries that you actually can't probably read there, but it points to an internationalism that isn't completely recognized, even though these are sort of nominal international contacts. So Works, the group I co-founded with Paul Woodrow, is actually one of those foreign contact centers in Canada. So can we look at the next one? This is a text of Telepathic Music 2, which is Robert was doing research on the Eternal Network and telepathic music, and you can read the text. It's dedicated, but not limited, to these Canadian members of the Eternal Network. Vehicle in Montreal, General Idea in Toronto, Works in Calgary, Image Bank in Vancouver, concentrating silently, sending waves of greetings, weather luck, man luck, woman luck, to any or all of the members of the Eternal Network the world around. Duration, a split second to all day or all night, or all day and night, all days and nights. Performance note, no proof of reaching or benefiting is necessary. Knowing yourself, suspecting others to be performers of telepathic music is sufficient. Suggested by Robert Filliou at the ADA Action d'Avant-Garde in Berlin in 1973 as part of the research on the Eternal Network. And the last image is, can we see that one, Thomas? It's not there. Okay, so the last image is Centerfold magazine in 1988. And I had the honor and pleasure of writing a memoriam text for Philia when he died. And that text, or a version of that text, was also published in the Balkan catalogue. And I had some intentions of reading from that text, but I think I'm good. I don't know how much time there is left in the 10 minutes. Anybody?
Your 10 minutes.
Timekeeping? It's 10 minutes? Yes?
Yes. Hi.
Exactly,
Is it 10 minutes?
exactly 10 minutes.
Can you just put the last image up?
I apologize, Clive. It's not come through.
Okay. It's an image of two women kissing on the front of Fuse magazine in 1988.
Can I ask if it gets through that we show it later? Because
Yes.
I want to see it.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you. That's it.
So I don't think we have any questions at the moment, but now I believe it's Judit who will be presenting. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just pull up your-
So happy Art's birthday, everybody. I'm in my Art's birthday t-shirt that we've made a couple of years ago, and I am in front of an artist's work called Isvan Montgomery, a man who will be mentioned in this. But also I think it quite nicely follows some of the things that you were talking today, Clive. So we'll see how the dots connect. So hi, I am Judit, and I'm a curator, as we said, and my interest in Filliou and in his ideas is really from a historic distance, and we could say twice removed, having never met Filliou in person like Clive did. It is actually based on my research as part of artists' networks since 1999, the time when I started to work with Artpool Art Research Center in Budapest, Hungary, which is an artist-run archive and also the network artwork of Hungarian artist György Galantine. Do we have the images?
Yes, they're coming. A moment.
Thank you. So this 10 minutes will be a very brief history, just as Clive was. There's very few things you can say in 10 minutes, but a very brief history of Filliou's connections with some Hungarian artists in the 1970s to give a wider picture of Filliou's network around the time when he also made Filliou and also had connections in Europe and in Canada. And so if we can see the images, I would start with the timeline very quickly. If you can go to the first image, Thomas.
Yeah, one moment.
Is it there?
Apologies, I just lost the link here.
Yep. It's just a very quick thing. While I was trying to put together these connections, I made a timeline between 76 and actually 98, and it's all linked somehow to Artpool, but also maybe other artists. And then if you turn to the next image, I try to make connections between how ideas of Filliou's developed, from the Eternal Network through research in permanent creation and in Eternal Network, and then how those ideas then spread through either meeting artists or connecting artists through time and space, both in Canada and in Hungary. And then interestingly, the Canadian and Hungarian links also start to connect. So this is really just to kind of fill some gaps. gaps maybe in our knowledge, maybe from our perspective where we see this network, we can see bits and then other people can see other bits. So this is what I saw for particularly this presentation. Filliou used permanent creation to replace art and the eternal network to replace the avant-garde, which he considered both as redundant. And then he also talked about artists as everyone who engaged with creative actions in their everyday life. Though it was later mostly used to describe the male art network specifically by some artists, I think Filliou talked about the eternal network in a wider sense. When you see quotes like when he says it's a collective effort of artists everywhere and one of the elements of the human network. If you go to the next slide. So Philia is one of the few Western artists who crossed the Iron Curtain at the time. He came to Hungary in 1976 for the invitation of László Becker. He's a curator and art historian. At the time, he was the director of the Young Artists Club in Budapest. And Becker knew Filliou through accessing a copy of Teaching and Learning as Performing Arts. And he invited Filliou to come to Budapest when probably nobody else knew him at the time. And Filliou came from Berlin with Joachim Pfeiffer, who was an architect. And together they were working at the time on the poipedram, which he wanted to present. Filliou understood art as research, which he also saw as the domain of those who don't know. So the poipedram, as many of his artworks, was a research in flux, which he used to explore permanent creation and to express, and I quote from Teaching and Learning, the functional relation of thinking, activity, and communication through action and reflection in art and life. The poipedram was conceived in 1963 and developed conceptually and physically as an ambulant environment, which followed the Sediki Suri, or the Smiling Sedilla, which was another center for permanent creation that Craig might talk about later, which he developed with friends between 1965 and 1968 in the south of France, but that was still connected to a fixed physical environment. So the Budapest version that you see on the left side of this slide was a fragile structure put together from wood slabs and with objects attached to it that Filliou collected from his time in Budapest, including a bunch of eggs, hen eggs, and also his flight ticket from Berlin. And this Budapest version was very significant in the development of the research project. And it followed the optimum version of poipedram, which you can see in the middle, which was a drawing, and the prototype, which was a sculptural installation in the Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels in 1975. So the Budapest poipedram was what he called as the first real space-time poipedram that manifested the idea of the Center for Permanent Creation as a social space and the real-time event that connected the urban reality of Budapest spiritually with the eternal network. If we get to the next slide, Thomas. So the Budapest poipedram also manifested Filliou's idea of the art of living through the photographs that he added to this wooden structure with the added text, "Art is what artists do." And the photographs were taken by Filliou and Pfeiffer when they arrived in Budapest. And they just show people getting on with their lives on the street of Budapest in 1976. And in the preview event where he showed the poipedram, he asked participants, who were actually mainly professional artists from the Hungarian avant-garde, to define the art they saw on the photos. So people, as part of the event, wrote things on the photographs like making friends, exhibiting, chatting, which manifested the idea, which framed the art of living on the streets and manifested the idea that Filliou proposed. This representation of the art of living is, of course, I think from today maybe creates a somewhat uneasy scenario, at least from a perspective of a historian, as the sort of social depiction of the urban proletariat of Budapest at the time, I think, slightly conflicts with Filliou's claims of an interchangeability of art and life. Because while perhaps he was offering a new way of thinking about art to artists who were at the preview by presenting everyday actions as art, the poipedram, of course, was very much a case when art was framing life rather than the other way around. But in an interview at the same time with the curator, Filliou also explained his position in response to the curator who asked Filliou if the poipedram was a Fluxus artwork. And Filliou was willing to accept this proposition, or more like to discuss this proposition, but only as much as it connects with the spirit of Fluxus that he saw as a poetic actions of anybody rather than only professional artists associated with Fluxus with a capital F. And Filliou also described in this particular interview the poipedram as a space for permanent freedom, which I think very much resonated with Hungarian artists at the time who lived under a regime that restricted both their creativity and their freedom to travel. Next slide, please. So György Galantai, who I'm talking about in relation to Artpool and who set up Artpool, was in the audience in 1976 in the preview of poipedram, but only developed a network connection with Filliou 3 years later through telepathic music. And here's a link to telepathic music and the Canadian network, of course. So telepathic music, as Clive already mentioned, was a manifestation of Filliou's research into the eternal network and perhaps a communication across time and space. Galantai used probably a kind of mailing list that Clive showed from Clive's Grow that he got hold of to circulate a poster of one of his exhibition. And he asked everybody who he sent this poster to send him information about their activities in return. And what happened is Filliou sent a postcard in return, which on the left you can see showing him on one side. And then on the other side of the postcard, you can see Robert Filliou, the father of Eternal Network. And under that, you can see a text under the title Telepathic Music, asking Galantai to print out the text as a poster and hang it at the entrance of the Young Artists Club. And the text, if you can read, just says, Telepathic Music, at Young Artist Club, fond remembrance, warm wishes, handshakes, Robert Filliou, September 1979. And then, of course, this postcard was an attempt of Filliou to communicate telepathically with the artist who he met in 1976 in Budapest. But at the same time, it was also a performative object that prompted and called for an action by Galantai, who then, responding to that, made the poster and hung it on the wall of the Young Artists Club, which you can see on a grainy image on the right of this slide. And that action gave Galantai an idea to start Artpool Periodical Space, which was a curatorial framework that after that, until 1999, Galantai and Artpool used for their own temporary networked events, exhibitions, and publications. So we could say that APS, Artpool Periodical Space, was Galantai's own version to create a center for permanent creation based on the knowledge of poipedram and telepathic music and the understanding of the eternal network. And that actually carried on much later after 1991 in his idea of setting up Artpool as an active archive, which is going on until today. The next slide, please. So Filliou, of course, also met another Hungarian Canadian artist, or connections with Hungarian Canada, István Kántor, who many of you will know, he might be even here, also known as Monte Kansin, Amen, in 1979. So just at the same time when Artpool had a connection. So Monte Kansin, István Kántor, now lives in Toronto, and he left Hungary in 1976, just at the year in poipedram, and lived in Montreal in 1979. And as he's explained recently in a series of Facebook posts, he introduced himself to Filliou after the lecture that Filliou gave at University of Quebec and made some video together. And I really encourage you to read István's memories of this meeting on his Facebook that you can see on the top of the slide, because he brilliantly describes his experience, but also maybe perhaps Filliou's amateur approach to video, which might be an interesting question in terms of Clive's experience of making videos with him. So what I wanted to finish with really is the last slide, which is an image that shows how sometimes the nodes in the eternal network collide. and also to show an example for how Filliou's ideas live on, maybe in both Artpool's activities and Isvan Kantor's nowist works. To mark the opening of P60 as Artpool's new exhibition space and as another node of the Eternal Network, in 1998, Artpool reconstructed the 1976 Budapest poipedram as part of a year-long research into what is an installation, and presented it as part of a much larger exhibition, which was basically made through a networked project with a call-out sent to mail art networks. And basically, the exhibition just included everything that they received in response for their open call on what is installation. But Galantai designed the whole exhibition around the poipedram, the reconstructed poipedram, extending its grid-like wooden structure with a wire grid across the whole exhibition space, and that he used to present all the other works. So if you see the middle image, you can see with the red circle, that was the place of poipedram, but the wire grid goes through the exhibition space, and that conceptually brings together all of the artworks that he presented within that exhibition space. So the exhibition space became an expanded poipedram conceptually, where the artistic products coming from different countries were linked to each other according to their content and erasing the borders between their countries. For the opening, they invited French artist Jean-Jacques Lebel, who was obviously a contemporary of Filliou and knew him very well, and Isvan Kantor, who also had this meeting with Filliou before, and who was touring at the time in Europe, to add something to the poipedram structure in the spirit of permanent creation and as an homage to Filliou. So my last thing is really just to describe the performance that Isvan Kantor did in 1998. So Kantor added a few of his pieces and objects to the installation, which included a curtain-like poem on paper, which he attached to the wall behind the structure, and which he wrote on with a mix of black ink and blood. He also put a folding chair inside the reconstructed wooden structure of the 1976 poipedram. To the side of the chair, he attached a mechanical wheel that he could spin while sitting on the chair, and then put a mushroom carpet under the chair made from real edible white mushrooms. In the performance, Kantor relied on loud sound and as a central component, a mesmeric industrial soundtrack, which was made louder by his screaming through the megaphone. A summoning of the spirit of Filliou, wearing a wire coat hanger on his head as a psychic or telepathic antennae, and also a neoist object, but also perhaps a link to Filliou's telepathic music. And finally, after being completely exhausted, he stopped and translated Filliou's message to the people present in the room. There are 6 bottles of champagne in the refrigerator. Open them and serve them to everyone. So I would really encourage everybody to maybe take that note as the last note, and also open a glass of champagne and cheers to Filliou and Art's birthday. The one last note I wanted to say, if you want to check out all the history, is that as part of the 1998 project, Artpool actually did a huge research on not just the history of the poipedram, but also on Filliou and what was at the time accessible online about Filliou. And they created a lot of different pages which are dedicated to Filliou on the Artpool website, which is just artpool.hu. And what's really nice connection to today is that website and the pages on the website were launched as part of the 1999 Art's birthday celebrations. So that's me.
Thanks very much, Judith. And Craig, if you'd like to share your presentation.
Sure. No questions for Judith?
Not at the moment. But yeah, I do encourage anyone who has questions to please share them in the chat, and we'll pose those. We're getting a lot of cheers and celebratory messages here.
Yes.
So I'll share my screen. Hopefully you can all see the Filliou book, a selection from 1,000 Basic Japanese Poems. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. So I'm very happy to be part of this panel. Thank you, Clive, for the invitation, and Thomas, and great to meet you, Judit. And looking forward to the conversation we'll be having later in the chat. My presentation today, or my comments really, will be through a small selection of publications by Philia, or related, well, by Philia, ranging at different moments in his career, and speaking to some of the concepts that have already been brought up through Clive and Judith's presentation. I'd also like to I'll end these slides with a reference back to where I'm located presently, which is Halifax, Nova Scotia. So because Philia does have a connection to he spent some time in Halifax, so we'll end up on that point. I wonder if I could ask Clive and Judith to mute their mics, just because I'm getting a little feedback. Thank you. So the first book I wanted to begin with, you can maybe see me in the margins over here. I have this a copy of this, a cherished copy of Philia's selection from 1,000 Basic Japanese Poems. And I wanted to point out the beginning, in the preface, the framework for this book is, in his words, a selection made out of the 1,000 basic Japanese words contained at the end of the booklet, Japanese in a Hurry. I wanted to show some examples. The first being this, using the word atsumaru, to gather, collect, crowd, swarm, get together, to meet, assemble, to draw, to be collected. I thought this was appropriate for our celebration of Art's birthday. The poem being in English, there's a time to gather, a time to collect, a time to crowd, a time to swarm, a time to get together, a time to meet, a time to assemble, a time to draw, a time to be collected. One more selection, although I could spend a little time. We could just mention this theme that runs through both, runs through the performances of Philia, and his character that comes across often is the fool, but the fool almost in a Shakespearean sense of the fool as the wise one, the one with the unexpected wisdom. There was a poem on that. Then the next is I wanted to just bring this example of atarishi, new, fresh, recent, modern. Everything is new, everything is fresh, everything is recent, nothing is modern. I thought this poem in particular had a nice connection to the idea of the eternal network. And I wanted to read from the eternal network, the manifesto, so to speak, or I don't think Philia would use manifesto, at least let's call it the score from the eternal network. And that is, there's always someone asleep and someone awake, someone dreaming asleep, someone dreaming awake, someone eating, someone hungry, someone fighting, someone loving, someone making money, someone broke, someone traveling, someone staying put, someone helping, someone hindering, someone enjoying, someone suffering, someone indifferent, someone starting, someone stopping. The network is everlasting. That is from this book that both Clive and Judith have already referenced. This poster that we're looking at is connected to, or is a promotional poster from La Cédille qui Sourit, which was located in Villefranche-sur-Mer in France, and this was both. It was a studio. It was a a flux shop. It was a meeting place. It was also visited very rarely, and it was possibly a prank. There are a lot of stories around this, and some of the most entertaining ones are the ones where Philia and George Brecht, who was his partner in this endeavor, would be down the street having coffee or pastis or something at the local cafe while the delicacies was closed and maybe people were trying to get in. This was so just passing through some more examples of some of the printed matter or artist book related objects with Philia. This was an amazing artist publication that was also a catalog for a show in the State Museum, or in München-Gladbach, where in 1969, where it was very similar to a type of flux kit. It contained a matchbox. This is as you can see just by the scale. Here's the tiny matchbox, and this was then within this very sort of ingenious format with the cutout corner. And you're looking at the description of the exhibition being in 3 parts for this catalog. The first being the catalog itself, the second being the gallery studio I just showed you called the CJTR, which was in Villefranche, and the third being the Eternal Network. So in that sense, never ending. Another book that was related to this location was one Clive's already mentioned, published through Something Else Press, which was a joint. It was mostly Dick Higgins of Fluxus, his initial venture, but through partnership with Emmett Williams at later moment in time, and Alison Knowles. This book contains what could be seen as event scores in relation to George Brecht's very famous events. You can see here, if you can read, if you can see the page, there are some examples of some of the games that could have come out of time spent at La Cédille-Quisserie, where these could have been just, playful gestures between George Brecht and Philia and their friends and partners who would have been in the space. So these blurrings of art and life, like in the words of Alan Capro, take a number of lights. Now, can you undo what you've done, as being an example of one of these event scores. Another being, take the thing nearest you. Where did you find it? So it's, just to check the time here. It's a fantastic book that is sort of a classic in connection to the performance practice of Philia, being one of playfulness, serious play, let's call it. The next image I wanted to show is, the next publication is one that Clive also mentioned. And I was interested to hear Clive say that it was one of the early introductions in Canada amongst Canadian artists to Philia's work. I'm going to show a few pages from this. It's a book that I go back to again and again, think about often when teaching myself, because of its invitation for participation. So there's an egalitarian spirit to this book and to the way Philia approached teaching itself. I'll point out here at the bottom, so this is the cover of the book. At the bottom, I love this description. It is a multi-book. The space provided for the reader's use is nearly the same as the author's own. The back of the book also refers to this type of participatory publication where there's a suggestion here that further editions will include developments and modifications suggested by readers who are also the co-authors. We'll see, let's get it out first. It's a long, short book to keep writing at home. It's a work of love. Again, with another reference to the importance of the reader's participation on the first page of the book. The book is by Robert Filliou, but is also by the reader, if he wishes. A few other pages from some examples of the book. Again, thinking about this, his term multi-book. The writing space provided for the reader's use is through the simple device of dividing the page in two, exactly the same as that taken by the author. Of course, the reader is free not to make use of the writing space, but it's hoped that he will be willing to enter the writing game as a performer rather than as a mere outsider. For this study is about permanent creation and audience participation. It is authored, co-authored with each reader who wishes it, by a man who believes in trying to close the gap between the artist and his public and joining them in a common creation. So the book, as an outline, as a substitute for a table of contents, is broken into teaching and learning as performing arts, reflections on the working of the system, what we're up against and why, the governmental sculpture, the point of view of children, the artistic proposition, the suggestions of artists. I find this interesting when looking into Filliou's work and his discussions of politics, which are more indirect than direct. And I'm certain our discussion will talk about his concept of, well, the title of the Belkin book was From Political to Poetical, the subtitle, From Political to Poetical Economy. And if I could just read a little bit of this, the reflections on the working of the system, November 1968. So when Philia is talking, he says, I'm talking of any system. Of course, my own experience is limited. He goes on to say that this isn't necessarily a critique of capitalism, but this book itself functions most fluidly and harmoniously with a socialist political system. He says, however, he says, this is why the ideas I'm sketching in this study can be of use, I think, under any system. But I believe that it is in a socialist society that the seeds they contain would have the better chance to grow. In favor of the system, it can be said that it works. Somehow, everywhere, people manage to be housed and fed, to reproduce themselves and to educate their children. On the other hand, there is a growing feeling of alienation on the part of young people. The tasks for which they are or were trained by the preceding generation do not seem very exciting. There's, in this egalitarian, socialistic egalitarian, utopian, to a degree, these aspects of Filliou's work, they extend everywhere, I feel, into the materials he uses, into his strategic techniques, into a do-it-yourself type of mentality. He discusses that within the pages of teaching and learning. So he does that through a definition of art. He says, I talk so much about art, I can hear you say, what is art anyway? Well, a few years ago I answered, what artists do? What do artists do? They organize creatively their leisure. You can find many other definitions. I too, but for purposes of this study, I'll stick with this one. Art is a form of organized leisure. The fact that it can be a hard one too, as my friend Emmett Williams once observed, does not, I suggest, invalidate this proposition. The same is true of skiing or football or making love, for that matter. here's a great page that just reinforces this idea of participating as a reader in the co-creation of, if not this book, a future book. Getting to the end of my presentation on my interest in Robert Filliou, starting with poetry, wrapping up with poetry. In this book, in Teaching and Learning, there's what he calls a collective poem that is described in this way. To mark the closing of an exhibition, L'Aujourd'hui de Demain in Museum of Arras, Emmett Williams, artist and poet who also has a strong connection to Halifax, a friend of Filliou's, they gave a joint performance of his ultimate poem and his collective one. Cards were distributed by Emmett to the audience. Everyone was invited to write down the name of something or somebody they would gladly get rid of. In regard of what they submitted to Emmett, in which I proceeded to read, you may want to perform the poem with your family and your friends by adding your own objects or people who you would gladly get rid of. And so as almost a chance poem, or a chance poem really, an old turnip, the poet, a brush, a fountain pen, my conscience, modern poetry, and so on. Last few slides. This is a book that was produced through NASCAD Press, edited by Peggy Gale, and it contains transcripts of talks that were given at NASCAD University back in the late 1960s, but up into 1977. And you can see here that Philia was one of the speakers at the time. This is an image related to today's event, Art's birthday. And this was the performance that occurred in Aachen. And this is a transcript on the right of the talk that Philia gave to a class of students and connected to the Art Now class. That was the David Askevold class where artists were invited and sometimes actually taught the course for a semester or for a month within a semester. And this is very interesting, while Philia was in Halifax on the topic of the Eternal Network, he went into, Clive and I were talking about this, and we believe that this is where he actually conceived of these elements of the Eternal Network, which, as Judit pointed out, was a substitute term for the avant-garde in the sense that it was an elimination of any idea of an avant-garde. So maybe in that what I'm showing you here was actually published within this period in the catalog from the Belkin show. So maybe I'll end there, and I can pull that slide back up again later if we want to look at the details of it.
Okay, can I add a couple of things here? Can I add a couple of things here?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Two things. Art is organized leisure. What does that remind us of? John Cage said, music is organized sound. The second thing, that Craig pointed up, my first engagement with Robert was as a curator of a show called Conceptographic Reading, which was a 6-hour artist television series. Robert sent me an 8mm film, which actually would have been great to have had with the image that we can't get up here of the centerfold cover. The film was called Do It Yourself. Judit has the only copy of that catalog remaining. It's called Do It Yourself, 1973. This is Robert's description. It is an 8mm erotic film that contains the title and Robert reading verbal instructions for men and for women. So those are the two things I wanted to sort of add directly to what Craig was, talking about in terms of, we haven't really talked about, the only other thing I wanted to suggest was we've mentioned this idea of research is the domain of those who don't know twice. The actual and very poetic quote, as I have said, I think it relates to the current focus and fascination on research creation in art scholarship. And so that the full thing that he said was, research is not the domain of those who know. On the contrary, it is the domain of those who don't know. Every time we turn our attention to something we don't know, we are doing research. And the interesting thing here is that we are claiming that we have knowledge of something, Filliou, and therefore the question is, what don't we know about Filliou? And it's a rhetorical question, but what don't we know about Robert Filliou and his work and the time in which he lived? And there's a lot. So
you suggest, Clive, we're doing research right now about Filliou, or perhaps we could in this conversation.
we are. And we're also pretending that you can't hear us? We're also asserting that we have knowledge, that we know, that we have done research, and that we know who and what Robert Filliou is. I mean,
I don't agree. We say we know. I think we say we know what we know, but that's different from we know.
Yeah. Okay. But we do say we know too.
We know what we know.
Yeah, exactly. No.
So I do have a question from the audience, a two-part question that I'll share here. First, Clive mentioned Greta Thunberg and Filliou's proposals for world peace. Can we say Filliou has a legacy in art and culture today? And if so, how?
It's a great question, and I wish Roddy would answer it himself if he was, within 5 feet of the. But I don't know. It's very. I mean, I think it's one of those. It's not a conceit, but it's one of those ways that we try and connect topics and issues that are very complex in a popular culture way, which is all I was trying to do there. I was very moved by seeing the documentary I mentioned for the second time. But I wish Roddy was here to answer his own question, because I'm sure he has a much better answer than I do.
There's also the follow-up question.
Yeah, I don't think is it melancholic or nostalgic? I think for a lost age, I think when you get to whatever age it is that you are at, this idea that something is nostalgic is really both true, and it's it's mostly what you have left, right? It's I'm living the 1970s and 80s because archivally, because I know them best, and I can't pretend to, in the 90s maybe, but I can't pretend to project that much into the 21st century. But I don't think, and as you can guess, Roddy, I think we can be both radical and utopian at the same time in this dystopian atomized epoch that you're referring to. But I have a different view of social media than a lot of people do. This is where I work and live a lot of the time, even though it's supposed to be one of the worst places to live and work in the world, right?
I think we have a crisis in well-being, and a crisis in being able to connect. So there's a lot of things, I think, when people start looking for alternatives, I think there's a lot of people are looking for alternatives at the moment. And I think when I think about Filliou's ideas, which were basically a lot of proposals, and a lot of them, you know, not for there to answer, but to be a mind opener. I like he used that word often, that the mind opener. And I think those are something that you can just hold on to think about. You know, what does it mean to connect, to be interconnected? What does it mean to share consciousness? How can we use humor, you know, in our life, to maybe solve or get closer to people, or solve potential problems rather than direct action. I think it's interesting. I don't think he was an activist in a sense that maybe Greta is. I think he was much gentler in his activism, in terms of trying to come up with a language for, or a theory for, a poetic economy that offers alternative. But he didn't fight, I think, for certain causes in a loud way. And I think he's somewhere he talked about that he gave up dealing with politics and the political economy. And I think that was there was a conscious decision there to fight the fight with poetical actions. So in that sense, I think it's interesting, but I think there's a relevance, and I think so many people actually find Filliou now. You know, one way to find him is a crisis in education. You know, there's a lot of projects that I see that is about, you know, de-learning and you know, the non-school, you know, and all that kind of artist projects that go back to kind of creative, progressive, pedagogic, you know, activities that were around before, to kind of review them and maybe connect with them. So there's another crisis there that I think, in terms of how we learn, what we learn, how do we educate, where he can be very relevant. And I think so I think there's a huge amount of ideas where he is and will be relevant. He's also still relevant in terms of what's the value of art. I think it's still relevant, that question of who's an artist and why, and who says so, who says who's an artist, and all that. These are eternal questions that, regardless of whether you live now or you lived in the 70s, these are questions. What do we value as art, and how do we define what is art, and who says so, who has the power? And the other thing, of course, is I think very relevant in terms of thinking through how Filliou lived, you know, completely poor, having nothing, but still making his life, you know, doing things as art, and how he did that, because there was an artist network kind of holding each other up. And that sort of network, I think, is still there. It's still invisible for much of the art world, regardless of how the art world is now obviously canonizing Filliou, canonizing a lot of other artists based on sort of formalities, like a sculptor, an expanded sculptor, a precarious works. So there is that path. But I think his real spirit still lives on in the Arts Birthday networks that we are part of now, lives on in Neoist networks, you know, lives on in Artpool, whose archive is literally full with artists who work beyond, you know, who work on the margins, work beyond the mainstream. Lived on, I think, telematic projects, telecommunication projects. I don't think Filliou himself was very much connected, you know, and I don't know whether he would use internet in a way, but, you know, if you think about 70s, 80s telecommunication projects, Robert Adrian X, another Toronto artist who lived in Wien and did a lot of projects where he wanted to, meet others, and he just came up with ideas to do telephone concerts and all that. None of these used travel, but it's all used communication. So I think those are all can be reviewed and thought about. What do we do when we cannot meet? What do we do when meeting is too expensive? There can be art. These are all alternatives, and I think he's very, very relevant. Or think about, we didn't mention, but we should mention Richard Martel and Nathalie Perrault and the Nomad Territories projects, which is fantastic and connected East and West, and and when, again, going back to the connection between space and time. So I think, there's so many artists who can connect with it, and he's so relevant. He's so relevant, regardless of where you lived or who you are now, how old you are. Sorry, I went on a bit too long.
Did anyone else want to respond to this? Otherwise, I do have another question, but Craig?
I'll pass on that, because I think just with the remaining time, that question that's come up, I think Clive would have quite a bit to say on that because of the research that he's done and the history he has with artist friend centers.
So I think that I think just one small thing. I agree with what Judit said. Except as long as when I met him, one of the things, he was not the only artist who had a very interesting life aside from being an artist before he actually engages as an artist in the late 50s, early 60s. And we know that he was an economist. We know that he worked in whatever role with a part of the UN for the economic redevelopment of Korea, which is something else, and that he was also a member of the French Resistance. So anybody who has that stretch of life, and he, as it's been described by his friends, he drops out of normal regular work in the 1950s, right, deliberately. So his and his peers' rejection of a certain politics is to be understood. In all, I don't want to say in all hemispheres, but in the Western Hemisphere for sure. It doesn't mean that people are not politically active. I still think that Robert, in a contemporary sense, was a cultural activist, very much so. Was he a public intellectual? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that we can say that. But yeah.
So here we have a question from Ali. At the beginning of the conversation, Clive recited the article. So I'm thinking about the beginning of artist activism in Canada in the late 60s with regard to remuneration and recognition, CARFAC, and the development of artists as administrators. Administrators of the Emerging Artist Center Network. Was Filliou involved in this at all, or interested in these developments?
I don't think Filliou was interested. I don't think Philia was interested in the type of organizational aspects that occurred even at the beginning of the Emerging Art Network. I don't think that was his. I think the network that Filliou came from, if I can describe it very briefly, is the type of network where artists who were doing ephemeral work or media work or whatever, they had their own network before the Eternal Network that existed, where those people who had jobs in universities, they would invite and circulate artists like Robert Filliou. And although we're not in a section and we don't about critiquing Robert, in Robert's time and in my time, not really my time, but my time as a student, at least up until the mid-70s, it was a boys' club, I mean, it's a network that is a boys' club as a parenthesis to that description, including the Eternal Network itself, right? It's still the Eternal Network as named in 68, 72, is still a boys' club. And I think it's, so I think in terms of the Artist-Run Center network and the development of artists as administrators, I think that the Sadi Kisri can be referred to as a prototype of a certain type of artist-run center, not being a gallery, but as a place for research and documentation and production wherever those means were possible. And so in that sense, I think it's very different than, say, Something Else Press, where Filliou, where some of Filliou's works were produced. But this history of artists, collectives and artist-run centers I love this. I don't like the topic, but of course I would have a lot to say about the topic, but we can't really take the time here. But I do think there's a lot more to talk about in terms of the different strata and different approaches to artist collectives and artist-run centers, that some of whom are more democratic than others, and so on and so forth. And the split that Filliou makes, he does make this division between the good and the bad in the art world. He refers to museums and larger institutions as bad, and he refers to smaller organizations, including small dealers and public galleries, as good. He says specifically in Teaching and Learning.
But that's very interesting, because he actually took part in quite a lot of museum exhibitions, even in his life.
Right.
So, he was not out of, he was very much connected with the artist-run scene. But to say that he was not connected to museums would be a lie. He was very much connected to museums and things like Documenta,
Clive, can I ask you, when Philia, when he visited in the 70s, when he came to Western Front, when he visited you in Calgary, do you think that, I'm curious if he contributed to the vocabulary and to the conceptualizing of the artist-run network across Canada, or at least in the West, if he contributed to that conversation, or if he was drawn there through an affinity.
I think I don't know if it happens simultaneously, but with a bit of distance, and I don't mean a lot of distance, but with a bit of distance, you can see the affinity with movements, right? With social movements. Filliou makes reference to, even if he doesn't, as Judit has said, doesn't make, he makes reference to the women's movement. He makes reference to him being a former phallocrat manabla, and he, as his colleague Joseph Boyce, is involved in the Green Party, not as a party, as he told me when I interviewed him, but as a movement. The recognition of the women's movement, the recognition of gay liberation, the recognition of the civil rights movement. Filliou is very aware of these things, and whether or not it's a stretch. One can definitely see by the 1980s that the Artist-Run Center movement is a parallel to social movements that are existing at the time, and the membership between those social movements and artist collectives and artist-run centers is fluid, right? So I think that's about all. I mean, it's not all I can say, but it's,
Yeah, I mentioned that because it was picking up on Ali's question, but I've often come across references to the Eternal Network as being literally applied by some to the Artist-Run Network. And I don't think it's that simple. We know it's not that simple.
I also think that might be something that is very strong maybe in the Canadian network. I think obviously we were discussing that before privately, but obviously, you know, in Canada, he was really, really involved with, I think, because you had a really strong artist-run network, an artist-run organization network. I think maybe elsewhere, he was maybe more connected with certain individuals. And then the individuals were artists, but as well, you know, in terms of the Fluxus network, he was very, very connected with, you know, like Brecht and Higgins, and, you know, he took part in, he was invited in Festival of Misfits, and, you know, all that. So he had that connections, and then he had a huge connection in Germany, but, you know, where he lived, and then he had another connection with Belgium. You know, and also the Netherlands, Amsterdam. But I think those were more with individuals. And then in Canada there were many more artist organizations. So maybe it's a different question also in terms of where you stayed or who he worked with, or you know, where he went to present works. I mean, in Europe, he often presents works in, you know, kind of gallery scenes and museums. But in Canada, he goes to universities, you know, to give lectures, and then he goes to artist-run centers because that's his network. So it's an interesting question, I think, to look at both, like how he may be connected or what he was interested in. But I do agree, I don't think he was interested in the administration of it or how to run an art center or anything like that. I don't think he was the type. He would have been quite chaotic.
I think the other thing I wanted to interject here is because it was my belief at the time and remains my belief that that what I value most I see in artist organizations. I mean, whether it's here, whether it's internationally. And as Judith said, you know, the definition of who is an artist and what is important about art and whatever else. I don't think artists are in any way perfect. And that's saying something. But I do recognize their initiatives. I like artist initiatives more than I like artists who then become curators' initiatives. I mean, I like artist initiatives. And one example in 1972-73 that I was part of, and that my partner Paul Woodrow was part of, was Fluxus in England. And Fluxus was not organized by Fluxus. It was a new temporary project of two people who brought together an intergenerational meeting of people who were Fluxus and people who were interested in and beginning to do work that was different than Fluxus. And they were invited, and it was a tour. You know, there were these phenomena in the late 1960s, early 70s of artists getting together on trains or touring together as if they were a band, or at least, you know, they were poets, you know. So I think those that are not artist-run centers or spaces necessarily. So I agree with you, Judith, and I think that I think there's a limitation of how much you can invoke artist-run centers in Canada and other networks where artists work together and yeah.
Well, it's interesting in Teaching and Learning, where he defines a system and then refers to his own political leanings towards an anarchistic, socialistic version of kind of community.
Can I just say something as well? Is that what's interesting is that he constantly thought about spaces. So he didn't think about, I think, artist-run spaces as such. But if you think about the Sedil, you know, the non-shop, if you think about poipedram, which was really seriously, you know, working with an architect on, you know, how to kind of spatialize something. So I think he was as much interested, concepts as well as he was interested in space or spatial, but it was maybe less to do with something that we would say as a kind of standard artist-run center. But I think the spatialization of network probably interested him. I mean, he often works through those ideas. And, you know, the center for permanent creation, you know, the center. So I don't think he only was, you know, so that's sort of anarchistic and chaotic, that system. And of course, the last time, you know, the Genial Republic, when he retired and, lived with Marianne, I think also that's a space, you know, it's like how do you live together, or how do you live, that kind of living space, not necessarily an art space, but how do you create a space around you as a living space that is an art space, that is, you know, maybe that's kind of interesting, but I don't think he ever thought about arts.
I think one thing I'd like to add here that we haven't mentioned is this idea that Robert has about the death of the avant-garde, and he attempts to prove it by talking about mathematics and who knows everything about math, right? This Poincaré. But he's also saying that about the network and about the changes that we can describe, that in fact becomes official policy in France and to a certain extent in Canada, of decentralization and democratization. Democratization is a can of worms, right? But decentralization, what Filliou meant was that you didn't have to live in a metropolis. You didn't have to live in Regina. You could live somewhere
no centers anymore. He said
where you are, and he was addressing artists. Where you are is what is where what is happening, and occasionally when we can afford to, we will get together.
But that's also to do, I think, with Zen. I think there's a lot from Zen in that, you know, where you are, where you breathe is where you are.
It also is official French cultural policy by 1975, right? And it becomes Canadian cultural policy by 1978. So the idea of democratization and decentralization, it's whether that's a governmental proposal that isn't enacted. Whether that's a governmental proposal that isn't enacted, I don't know. And we could argue about it elsewhere. But I think we have to keep Filliou's utopian ideas and actually what is happening at a community, even at a governmental level, even at a state level, sometimes in parallel with each other, because they're not as distant as we would like to believe in a utopian sense, right?
I think Judit makes an excellent point there and brings in a very important aspect of many of the Fluxus artists that we know, and Philia in particular, around Zen, and adding that one other, so there should be at least one other strain of the individual. And so the societal, the political, and then the individual, where presence is such an important concept within Zen practice. Wherever you're located,
and that's actually where Philia would end this discussion. That's where Philia would end this discussion, right there, at Z and Zen.
That's perfect. Thanks so much, Clive, and thanks, Craig and Judit. And this discussion can and I think will go on, and encourage you to find the places that this will take place. Clive's Facebook page is, of course, a great place to do it, as is Dunlop Art Gallery's Facebook and YouTube post, where this video will be archived. And yeah, there are many other comments on here, which I welcome you to visit. As part of Art's Birthday, which we're celebrating today, do encourage you to visit Neutral Ground's website, also for further events through the evening. Thanks again, Clive, Judith, and Craig, and everyone who was able to attend. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Stay well.